The morning sun painted soft patterns across the polished wooden floors of Sarah's home, casting an almost too perfect glow. Everything was as it always had been, peaceful, organized, familiar. Sarah, standing at the kitchen counter, watched her husband Daniel from across the room. He sat at the dining table, scrolling through his phone, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Did you want cream in your coffee today?" she asked, her voice calm but searching for connection. "Just black," Daniel replied without looking up, his tone neutral. Sarah nodded and poured the coffee into his cup, the faint aroma swirling around her. She placed the cup on the table beside him and waited for a moment, hoping he might look up, might thank her, might notice her. He didn't. She picked up her own coffee and walked toward the window. The garden outside was lush and alive, but Sarah felt detached from it, as though she were staring at a painting instead of her own backyard. The flowers needed trimming, the grass needed mowing, but today the vibrant scene did nothing to lift her spirits. Daniel's voice broke her thoughts. "What time are we meeting the Grants on Saturday?" "7," she said, turning to him. He nodded absently, his eyes still fixed on his phone. There had been a time when Saturday night plans had meant excited whispers about what to wear, stolen kisses before leaving the house, and warm laughter that lingered long into the evening. Now their evenings were predictable, filled with polite conversation and silence that spoke louder than any words. That evening, as they ate dinner, the room was heavy with the sound of cutlery against plates. Sarah made an effort to talk, asking Daniel about work, but his answers were brief, his gaze distant. "Ethan's recital is next week," she said, trying to keep the conversation alive. "I know," Daniel replied. "I marked it on the calendar." Sarah pushed her food around her plate, the weight of their routine settling in her chest. She longed for something she couldn't quite name. A spark, a change, a reminder of what their marriage used to be. As the night wore on, Daniel fell asleep on the couch, the flicker of the television casting shadows on his face. Sarah watched him from the doorway, her thoughts spiraling. She wondered if this was what life was meant to be: comfortable, predictable, and quietly unfulfilling. The next day, Sarah attended a friend's birthday gathering at a small cafe downtown. The group laughed and reminisced, their voices filling the cozy space. For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt a faint sense of lightness. Toward the end of the evening, Claire, a friend she hadn't seen in months, introduced Sarah to a man named Lucas. He was charming and polite, with an easy smile that made her feel at ease. Their conversation was light at first, revolving around mutual friends and favorite books. "I didn't expect to meet anyone interesting today," Lucas said, his tone playful. Sarah laughed softly, surprised at how natural it felt to talk to him. "You flatter too easily," she replied, her voice carrying a hint of warmth she hadn't felt in a long time. They exchanged numbers at the end of the evening, under the pretense of book recommendations. As Sarah walked home, her heart felt lighter but conflicted. The encounter had been innocent, but the way her thoughts lingered on Lucas made her stomach twist. When she arrived home, Daniel was in bed, his breathing deep and steady. Sarah stood in the doorway, her mind filled with the warmth of Lucas's smile and the reality of the life she had built with Daniel. The week after Sarah met Lucas passed in a blur of routine. Days began and ended predictably, yet her mind was anything but still. At first, she dismissed her thoughts about Lucas as harmless. After all, it wasn't unusual to enjoy someone's company. But the way she caught herself replaying snippets of their conversation or wondering what book he might suggest next made her uneasy. It began innocently enough. Lucas texted her a few days later. "I found the book I mentioned. You'd love it. Should I send you the link?" She smiled at her phone, surprised at how quickly the message brightened her mood. Typing back, she kept her tone casual. "Sure, thanks. Always looking for a good read." His reply came moments later, and their exchange snowballed into a light-hearted conversation that stretched across the afternoon. Sarah found herself checking her phone more frequently, the small pings of his messages a distraction from the monotony of her day. At home, the silence between Sarah and Daniel became more palpable. He worked longer hours, coming home tired and distracted. Conversations felt like reruns with the same questions and the same replies. One evening, Sarah tried to bridge the gap. Over dinner, she asked, "Do you remember when we used to talk about where we'd go for our anniversary? Somewhere special?" Daniel glanced up briefly, his fork paused mid-air. "Of course I do. We'll go next year. Things are just hectic right now." "Next year?" The words sat heavily in her chest. Sarah forced a smile and nodded, but the sting of his dismissal lingered. After dinner, as Daniel immersed himself in his emails, Sarah sat by the window, her phone glowing softly in her hand. Lucas had sent another message. "You should visit this cafe I found. Great coffee and even better atmosphere. Let me know if you want to see it sometime." Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She knew she shouldn't encourage him, that meeting again could cross an invisible line. But a small voice whispered in her ear, reminding her of the way Lucas had made her feel, valued, vibrant, alive. The following Saturday, Sarah told Daniel she was meeting Claire for lunch. It wasn't entirely untrue. She had planned to see Claire earlier, but their meeting ended quickly. As Sarah walked to the cafe Lucas had mentioned, her heart pounded with nervous anticipation. Lucas was already there when she arrived, sitting at a table near the window. His face lit up when he saw her and he stood to greet her, his easy charm as disarming as ever. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said, his smile genuine. "Neither was I," Sarah admitted, her voice quieter than she intended. They talked for hours, their conversation flowing effortlessly. Lucas asked questions that no one else seemed to ask anymore. About her aspirations, her favorite childhood memories, even her hidden fears. Sarah hadn't realized how much she had missed feeling heard. As they walked out of the cafe together, Lucas gently touched her arm, stopping her mid-step. "I don't mean to overstep, but I think you're incredible," he said, his voice low but earnest. Sarah froze, her thoughts a whirlwind. She wanted to brush it off, to laugh it away, but the intensity in his eyes rooted her in place. "Lucas," she began, but the words died on her lips. When she returned home that evening, Daniel was on the couch watching television, his eyes flicking to her briefly before returning to the screen. "How was lunch with Claire?" he asked casually. "Good," Sarah said quickly, avoiding his gaze. She slipped into their bedroom, closing the door softly behind her. Sitting on the edge of the bed, she stared at her reflection in the mirror. Guilt pricked at her skin, but so did something else. An undeniable thrill she couldn't quite explain. Her phone buzzed beside her, and her stomach flipped as she saw Lucas's name. The message was simple. "Thanks for today. I meant everything I said." Sarah put the phone down, her heart heavy with conflicting emotions. The line she had sworn never to cross was suddenly closer than she'd ever imagined. The days that followed were a delicate balancing act for Sarah. Every text from Lucas felt like a spark, illuminating a part of her she thought had faded. Yet each interaction also added to the growing weight of guilt that followed her like a shadow. She wasn't entirely sure why she couldn't stop. Maybe it was his attention, or perhaps it was the way he seemed to truly see her. Whatever it was, it felt intoxicating. At home, Daniel remained unaware of the turmoil brewing within her. Their evenings followed the same predictable script. A shared dinner, small talk about their day, and then the quiet retreat to separate corners of the house. She often caught herself studying him, his familiar gestures, the sound of his laugh when something on TV amused him. It made her wonder, had they both grown blind to each other over the years, or was she the only one who felt this rift? One morning, Sarah sat at the kitchen table, sipping her coffee while Daniel rushed to get ready for work. His tie was askew, and his expression was one of mild irritation as he searched for his car keys. "Did you check the counter?" Sarah asked, gesturing toward the cluttered surface where his keys often ended up. "I did, and they're not there," he muttered, his tone clipped. "They're right there," she said, standing to retrieve them. She held the keys out and he took them without looking up. "Thanks," he said absent-mindedly, already turning toward the door. "Have a good day," she called after him, but the door closed before she finished her sentence. She stood there for a moment, her hands still outstretched. The interaction was small, insignificant, but it left her feeling hollow. Later that afternoon, Lucas texted her again. "Still thinking about our coffee the other day. When can we do it again?" She stared at the message, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. She wanted to respond, to feel that spark again, but something in her hesitated. Before she could overthink it, her phone buzzed with another message, this time from Claire. "Hey, are we still on for lunch tomorrow?" Sarah frowned, realizing she'd used Claire as an excuse for her last meeting with Lucas. The thought of lying again felt like walking on a crumbling bridge. She typed back quickly, "Of course. Looking forward to it," but her thoughts kept circling back to Lucas. She hated the way her chest tightened whenever she thought of him, equal parts longing and guilt. That evening, Sarah and Daniel sat across from each other at dinner. He was scrolling through his phone while she picked at her food. "Daniel," she said suddenly, her voice breaking the silence. He looked up, his brow furrowing slightly. "Yeah." She hesitated, her words catching in her throat. For a moment she considered telling him everything. About Lucas, about the way she felt invisible in their marriage. But the vulnerability of that thought terrified her. "Never mind," she said quickly, forcing a smile. "It's nothing." Daniel studied her for a moment longer, then shrugged and returned to his phone. As Sarah lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, she realized how far apart they had drifted. The thought was unbearable, yet she couldn't bring herself to reach out. The next week she met Lucas again, this time under the pretense of running errands. The tension between them was undeniable, and when they sat down at the same cafe, his hand brushed against hers as they reached for the sugar at the same time. "Sorry," he said, his voice soft but laced with something more. She shook her head, unable to meet his gaze. "It's fine, Sarah," he said, his tone more serious now. "What are we doing here?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unspoken until now. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Lucas leaned closer, his eyes searching hers. "I think you do." Her heart raced, torn between the magnetic pull of his presence and the crushing guilt she felt every time she thought of Daniel. That night, Sarah returned home to find Daniel waiting for her in the living room. His expression was calm, but there was something in his eyes she couldn't quite place. "How was your day?" he asked, his voice steady. "Fine," she replied quickly, avoiding his gaze. Daniel nodded but said nothing else, his silence unnerving. As she headed to their bedroom, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She didn't need to look to know it was Lucas. For the first time, Sarah wondered if Daniel already knew, if he had been watching the cracks in their marriage widen but, like her, was too afraid to confront them. As she sat on the edge of the bed, her phone glowing in her hand, she felt like a pendulum, swinging endlessly between two worlds with no end in sight. Sarah's heart raced as Lucas's words lingered. She glanced at him, his face a mixture of curiosity and concern. He wasn't pressuring her. There was no demand in his tone, but the weight of the question pressed down on her. "I don't know," she admitted softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Lucas leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "I didn't mean to make this complicated. I care about you, Sarah. More than I probably should." Her breath hitched at his honesty. There it was, everything she had been feeling mirrored in his words. She bit her lip, unsure of how to respond. "I never planned for this," she said finally, her hands trembling as they cradled her coffee cup. "I didn't even think I could feel this way again." Lucas reached across the table, his hand lightly brushing hers. "You don't have to explain yourself to me," he said gently. "But I need to know if this is something you want, or if I'm just making things harder for you." The sincerity in his voice pulled at her heart. She couldn't deny how alive she felt around him, how his presence seemed to awaken parts of her she thought had been lost. But as much as she craved the connection, the thought of what she was risking sent a jolt of fear through her. "I don't know what I want," she said, her voice trembling. "Everything feels tangled." Lucas nodded, his expression understanding but tinged with disappointment. "Then maybe you need to figure it out. For your sake and mine." As she drove home that evening, Sarah replayed the conversation in her mind. Lucas's words had left a mark, forcing her to confront the reality of the situation. She couldn't keep living in this limbo, caught between two worlds. When she pulled into the driveway, the house loomed before her, its windows glowing warmly against the night. It was the same house she had built her life in, yet it felt strangely unfamiliar, as though it belonged to someone else. Inside, Daniel was in the living room, flipping through channels. He glanced up as she entered. "Hey," he said with a smile. "How was your day?" "It was fine," she replied automatically, setting her bag down. He didn't press further, turning his attention back to the television. Sarah stood there for a moment, watching him, wondering how they had reached this point. The next few days were a blur of routine and restlessness. Sarah found herself snapping at Daniel over minor things. A forgotten grocery item, the way he left his shoes by the door. Each argument felt like a mask slipping, revealing the cracks in their marriage that neither of them wanted to acknowledge. One evening, as they sat in silence after dinner, Daniel finally spoke. "Is something going on, Sarah?" he asked, his voice cautious. Her stomach tightened. What do you mean? You've been distant, he said, his gaze searching hers. If something's wrong, I want to help. But I can't if you won't talk to me. His words were sincere, but they only deepened her guilt. She wanted to tell him everything, to lay it all bare, but the fear of losing him held her back. I'm fine, she lied, forcing a smile. Just stressed, that's all. Daniel didn't look convinced, but he nodded, choosing not to press further. One afternoon, Sarah received a text from Lucas. I can't keep doing this. You need to decide, Sarah. Her hands shook as she read the message. The truth was, she couldn't imagine her life without him now. But the thought of tearing her family apart was equally unbearable. That night, she sat alone in the bedroom, staring at her phone. The weight of her choices pressed down on her, suffocating in its intensity. When Daniel walked in, he paused, sensing the tension in the room. Sarah, he said carefully, whatever it is, you can tell me. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears. For a moment, she considered confessing everything. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she whispered, I'm just tired. Daniel nodded, his expression softening. Then let's get some rest, he said, climbing into bed beside her. As the darkness enveloped them, Sarah lay awake, caught between the man who had been her safe haven and the man who had reignited her passion. The decision loomed before her, unavoidable and impossible. Sarah spent the next day in a haze. She couldn't focus. The conversations she had with Daniel felt like a distant hum, like background noise to the chaos of her own thoughts. Every time she looked at him, she saw the man she had once loved. Still kind, still caring, still the person who had shared her life. But the connection they had once shared felt fragile now, as though it could crumble with a single touch. And then there was Lucas, whose presence had become an intoxicating escape, a chance to feel desired, understood, and wanted in ways that she hadn't in years. She sat alone in the kitchen, staring out the window. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard. Her phone was in front of her, and she had read the text from Lucas more times than she cared to admit. I can't keep doing this. You need to decide, Sarah. The decision weighed on her like an anchor, dragging her deeper into the uncertainty of what was to come. She had spent so much of her life making decisions for everyone else, Daniel, her family, her work, that now when it came to making a choice for herself, she felt paralyzed. She had always prided herself on knowing what to do, always confident in the paths she chose. But this was different. The door creaked as Daniel entered the room. She hadn't noticed him approach, but now there he stood, looking at her with those soft, understanding eyes that she had always known so well. His presence, though comforting, now felt like a heavy reminder of what she might lose. I can't keep pretending, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. I've been lying to myself. And to you. Daniel sat down beside her, his hand gently touching hers. Sarah, what's going on? You're shutting me out. Her heart pounded in her chest. The moment was fragile, and the words she was about to speak could shatter it all. But she couldn't keep living in limbo. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay. I don't know who I am anymore, she admitted, tears filling her eyes. I feel lost. And I don't know if I can stay here with you anymore. Not when I'm feeling this way. Daniel's face softened with understanding, though his eyes betrayed a quiet sadness. I didn't think it would come to this, he said, almost to himself. But I can't keep fighting for something that isn't real. The silence between them was heavy. It wasn't anger, nor was it regret. It was the sorrow of something inevitable. They had both known this moment would come, but neither had been ready for it. Later that night, as Sarah stood in the dark, she finally made the choice she had been avoiding. She picked up her phone, her fingers trembling as she typed a simple message to Lucas. I'm ready to decide. But I don't know what that means yet. She couldn't promise him everything, but she knew she couldn't keep living in a world where she was torn between two realities. It wasn't just about choosing between Lucas and Daniel. It was about choosing herself, about figuring out who she truly was in this new, uncertain chapter of her life. As Sarah lay in bed, she stared at the ceiling, the weight of the choice settling over her like a blanket. The question had always hung in the air. Who would she stay with? The safe, familiar love of Daniel? Or the thrilling, raw passion of Lucas? The answer wasn't simple, and perhaps it never would be. But Sarah knew one thing for certain. She couldn't keep living in the in-between forever. Whether it was with Daniel, with Lucas, or alone, she had to find a way to move forward. And so, the question remained unanswered, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she was still figuring out who she was meant to be in the first place.